Hey everybody, welcome to week 4. We're going to touch base with you quickly on, this week's main topics and the assignments related to those. And I want to show you sort of some slides to help illustrate these. This week I've combined portions of chapter 6 and chapter 10 in the same week about environmental use of space and then religious use of space. The discussion board for week 4 will deal with chapter 10, religious use of space. And we look at sort of how space is used for religion. We look at, think most notably about, like sacred sites or pilgrimage locations. They'd be like, folks going to the Holy Land to visit, the Jews and the Wailing Wall, or Christians and, the church, the sepulchre where Christ was sacrificed, or for Muslims, the Dome of the Mount where Muhammad ascends to heaven. So we think about sort of those pilgrimage locations, or even around us, sacred spaces, temples, churches, or other religious sites, and how we sort of organize those. Where these places are located in terms of the community, or the center town, on the outskirts, that might carry some weight or meaning. And then in that religious society or group, whichever it is, gender divisions, males and females, how they get organized, in that religious space. And every religion sort of tackles this differently, even within all of Judaism or Islam or Christianity, even sort of within different sects, it's dealt with differently. So the chapter gets into those sorts of topics. Your discussion board for week 4 focuses on the caste system in India and sort of how the Hindus have this very rigid caste system. And it looks at, as I bolded here, spatial expression of beliefs and practices. When you're in India, how this caste system organizes people in the space in India, particularly in urban centers. So focus on those portions of the assignment and think about that for the discussion board, chapter 10. The other assignment from chapter 6 deals with sort of an environmental use of space and sort of how we organize that environmentally based on sort of our human interaction with the land at large. And in chapter 6, some of the important things to think about, I put in bold here, how we as humans depend, adapt, and modify the physical environment. How we as humans attach cultural meanings to the environment, and also how we manage the land in terms of the environment. It could be for cultural, economic, or political purposes, but suffice it to say, we sort of manage that. And then the last point to focus on in chapter 6 is our human interactions with that land. And the assignment for this week, the Anthropocene assignment, will have you really focus in on those human interactions with the environment at large and the impact human beings have on the overall environment. So those might sort of target your reading, where you're reading in these 2 chapters for this week, and also tie with the assignment or assignments. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about 3 more slides here, but just talk about chapter 6, the environmental impact, sort of how humans shape the environment. And there's sort of 3 main categories that the book looks at. There's sacred space, productive space, and managed space. And sacred space is sort of what it sounds like. And it can be religiously sacred, synagogues, churches, or other religious centers. But even it can be sort of sacred in terms of people's emotional attachment to the land and reverence to that landscape. I'm thinking even sort of locally, there's reverence to sort of the land, even in the Salisbury area, in terms of sort of cultural heritage that also gets attached to it. I think, for example, like the Ward Foundation in Salisbury, and it focuses on sort of the connections of the natural environment and the cultural history of the Eastern Shore, from waterfowling to decoy carving to hunting, and that relationship with the land and waterfowling at large. So sacred space isn't always about religion, but it can be about sort of cultural attachments to that land around it. The other category, if you will, is productive space. And being on Delmarva, I think we think a lot about agricultural societies, the chicken farming, and also the soybeans and corn around us that go along with the chicken farms, or this agricultural emphasis on that productive land, the land itself. But even sort of broader than that, I think about the Purdue headquarters. I think about the processing facilities, the airport itself, all this sort of land devoted to us being more economically productive with the space that we have. And with that productivity, it leads to sort of rising standard of living for all of us in the area. If we didn't have these chicken farms, the airport, Purdue, things like that, there'd be sort of less job opportunities for people around here and would create, I think, a lower standard of living. So productive space is seen as sort of a use of the land to for job applications, economic uses, and sort of creating a higher standard of living for people at large in the area. Third category to look at is managed space. And this will get us into the last slide in a second, but we in Delmarva, or even in Maryland, or even the larger United States, we look at sort of managing space. As Salisbury grows, as Ocean City grows, as Baltimore grows, we look at sort of managing that urbanization growth and balance it with the environmental impacts of sort of the natural landscape at large too. And we can see this all around us, from like Pemberton Park down the road in Salisbury, the Salisbury Zoo, Assateague Seashore, national parks, county parks, state parks. We're looking at protecting that sort of land as cities grow, to protect sort of natural environments. National parks are sort of an example of this, but we see some value within a sort of that untouched landscape and a desire to protect that. And the last slide to look at, speaking of protecting that, the book talks about the Kuznets Curve, and this is a relationship here between people's proclivity to protect the environment as it ties in with the sort of average per capita GDP income. And you think about like little economics here, but like gross domestic product is the total sum of a nation's productivity, and sort of a gauge of that country's productive capabilities to produce final finished goods. And the bigger the GDP, the bigger the economy. And economists look at GDP per capita, the sort of economic growth per person, and that gives an apples to apples comparison amongst any country, sort of makes them equal. The point here is that as we see per capita income in a country grow, people care more about the environment. And this Kuznets curve sort of demonstrates as on the bottom, the x-axis, per capita income, on the y-axis, up and down, environmental degradation. As per capita income increases, we see this sort of increase in degradation, but then as the income continues, then there's a decrease in degradation. The basic idea is that the higher a nation's per capita GDP income, the more people care about the environment. And this is what this curve is trying to catch. There's some level of per capita income, and we don't know what the exact level is. There's no sort of like finite cutoff number, but the pattern remains the same because it might vary from location to location to location, because the U.S., China, Sudan, Brazil are very different countries, but the pattern remains the same. So at high income levels, economic growth leads to economic improvement. So the more income people have per capita, the more environmentally conscious those people are going to be. The lower the per capita income, the less environmentally conscious those people are going to be. And sort of the idea behind this is that in rapidly developing nations, the effect of the actual growth of that country is going to overwhelm any kind of environmental regulatory attempts, because it's going so quickly and so rapidly. People really aren't going to care or have time to sort of think about the environmental impacts or protecting the impacts. In wealthier countries, the United States, Canada, Japan, places like that, growth is slower, and pollution reduction efforts in those countries tend to overcome the effects of that growth level. If you think back to a few chapters ago, sort of the Rostow's phases of economic development. As you become more economically developed, you sort of have the time, the wherewithal, the energy to focus on environmental concerns. And there's an example that I came across in a Nature magazine article that sort of talked about this, but looked at the U.S. from like 1970s to now, and they looked at the number of cars and trucks on the road and the sort of pollutants coming from those cars: carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, all that stuff coming out the tailpipe. And in this sort of 50-year period, the U.S. GDP grew by almost 200%. So growing very rapidly in the United States from like the 70s up to like about 2010, give or take. Okay, and in that time period, people are driving cars more and more and more as GDP increases. People are getting more cars, standard of living increases, and driving miles goes up by almost 200% too. People are driving more. There are more cars on the road, more pollutants coming out of those cars that sort of roll down the highway. However, what economists found out is that in that same period of time, there were regulatory changes, Clean Air Acts, fuel standards, regulations on like catalytic converters for vehicles, all these sort of things come out from the government to regulate these pollutants. And what they found is in that same time period, from like the 70s to like the 2010s, even though GDP is going up, even though cars are more folks are buying cars, more miles driven, they also found that emissions of sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, other sort of loose particulates in the air decreased by 80% in that sort of 50-year time period, or 60-year, give or take. So it's sort of this evidence supports this sort of idea that as GDP per capita increases, people are more apt to care about the environment and then sort of work to protect that environment. Incidentally, they also see, I guess, these economists who sort of study this, they see that countries with increasing GDPs also have sort of net losses in deforestation rates. So there's a correlation there between high GDPs per capita and then increased environmental awareness and lower pollution levels. So we see most sort of pollution in the world today, most pollution comes from the developing world, as they're sort of on that left side of this graph here. And then on this right side is the developed world. So as these developing nations are moving through this sort of growth, they're also, I guess, emitting higher levels of pollution. When you do your nation investigation project, that's something to sort of think about. Okay, quick overview, good talking to you. I'll see you guys next week.